Hello to everyone watching. I'm Yulia Horova, and this is your deep dive into the most important geopolitical events. Everything you might have missed right here on UATV. So today in the episode, Ukrainian drones are taking out Russia's shadow oil fleet, and the Kremlin, desperate to seize all of Donetsk, still can't fully capture Pokrovsk. Peace talks play out in both Moscow and Florida. Washington unveiled its new national security strategy. And Putin is once again blackmailing Europe, launching massive strikes on Ukraine and spreading fake stories about a possible Russian offensive on Chernihiv and Kharkiv. We'll get to all of in the moment. For now, follow us, drop us a like, and get ready for a packed show. Russia is still demanding that Ukraine hand over all of Donbass with no objections and no compromises. And the United States still hasn't found a solution to this issue. These territorial questions and security guarantees become the main focus of Saturday's meeting between President Volodymyr Zelensky and member of Donald Trump's team, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. The talk, which lasted about 2 hours, wrapped up 3 days of negotiations between the United States and Ukrainian sides on a possible peace deal. Reporters say that the conversation was difficult. Witkoff and Kushner gathered the positions of both sides and urged both Putin and Zelensky to make the concessions needed to move toward an agreement. Talks between Kiev and Washington have been ongoing since Friday and will continue through Monday. According to Rustem Umerov, head of the Ukrainian delegation and secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, the meetings focused on finding a realistic and workable path to a lasting and just peace. Participants reviewed the outcomes of the recent United States-Russia meeting and agreed that any real progress depends on Moscow's willingness to show it is genuinely committed to peace. Earlier this week, on December 2nd, the United States delegation arrived in Moscow. Washington described the talks there as a positive and a step forward. But Kremlin clearly disagrees. Putin's aide Yuri Yushakov stated immediately afterward that no compromises were found and that the sides' position remained fundamentally different.
A compromise option has not been found yet, but some of the American proposals look more or less acceptable, but they need to be discussed. Some of the formulations that were offered to us are not suitable for us, so the work will continue.
The meeting lasted about 5 hours and started over 2.5 hours late, after Putin kept the American delegation waiting. A familiar gesture of dominance. While they waited, Russian officials took Witkoff and Kushner on a tour of Moscow and later hosted them at an upscale restaurant, a typical Kremlin tactic meant to set the tone of the conversations. After the meeting, Moscow claimed the sides were no closer and no farther from peace than before. Trump, however, publicly said his envoys left with the impression that Russia genuinely wants to end the war. The comment sounded optimistic, but in Kyiv and across Europe, it's viewed more as a political signal than evidence of any real shift in the Kremlin's position.
President Putin had a very good meeting yesterday with Jared Kushner and with Steve Witkoff. What comes out of that meeting, I can't tell you, because it does take two to tango. You know, Ukraine, I think we have something pretty well worked out with them. They're very satisfied, considering.
Russia's dictator Vladimir Putin is openly dismissing any real compromises and keeps escalating. Despite all the talk about peace initiatives, the Kremlin continues to strike Ukraine night after night. In the night of December 5 to 6, Russian forces launched a large attack to Ukraine's energy infrastructure in several regions. They used Shahed attack drones, as well as ballistic and cruise missiles. Some areas were left without electricity, and several people were injured. And the very next day, Russia again fired deadly Kinzhal and Iskander ballistic missiles at Ukraine. Their goal remains the same: to leave Ukrainians without heat, without electricity, in the middle of the winter. Russia isn't shying away from targeting nuclear facilities either. The International Atomic Energy Agency reported that the protective sarcophagus over the Chernobyl nuclear power plant has lost its essential safety functions and can no longer reliably contain the radioactive materials inside the fourth reactor, which was destroyed in 1986. Repairing it will cost Ukraine nearly $30 million. As a reminder, Russia struck the sarcophagus with a drone back in February 2025. And despite the risk of a major accident, they have continued launching drones and missiles toward the Chernobyl exclusion zone ever since. As diplomatic efforts intensify, the White House published an updated United States National Security Strategy, a document that shapes American foreign policy for years ahead. Among its stated priorities, establishing stable strategic relations with Russia and ending the fighting in Ukraine as quickly as possible. The document makes it clear Washington wants to avoid prolonged confrontation between Moscow and Europe. It also emphasizes that United Union countries should take a more active role in their own regional security. One line especially stands out. From now on, the affairs of other countries will concern the United States only when they directly affect American interests.
The days of the United States propping up the entire world order like Atlas are over. We count among our many allies and partners dozens of wealthy, sophisticated nations that must assume primary responsibility for their regions and contribute far more to our collective defense.
It also points to growing tensions between the United States administration and some European officials who have what Washington describes as unrealistic expectations about the war in Ukraine. The United States wants to help Europe to correct its current trajectory. Another notable point is criticism of NATO's overexpansion, a theme Russia regularly weaponizes in its messaging. In the final section, the strategy states that smaller countries naturally have less influence than large, powerful states. So Washington's goal, it says, is to prevent the emergence of dominant rivals of the global stage, consistent with the broader United States policy of containing China and limiting actors who could alter the global balance of power. Europe reacted to the document with mixed feelings. What do you think about the updated United States strategy? Do you support this foreign policy shift? Please write your opinion in our comments below the video. A recent Reagan Institute poll found that 64% of Americans support providing United States weapons to Ukraine and 62% believe Ukraine must win. Americans want strong United States leadership, military strength, and solid alliances to counter rising authoritarian threats. And this year's numbers show record high support for helping Ukraine and growing trust in NATO. We would also add that, according to Ukraine's ambassador to the United States, Olha Stefanishina, Ukraine continues to enjoy strong bipartisan support in the United States Congress. Ahead of the meeting with Witkoff and Kushner, Putin claimed that Europe, not Russia, is obstructing peace efforts. He insisted that Europeans are making unacceptable proposals and still cling to the idea of inflicting the strategic defeat on Russia. He also warned that although he supposedly never intended to fight Europe, he would strike first if necessary.
We are not going to fight Europe. I've said this 100 times already. But if Europe suddenly wants to fight us and starts, we are ready right now. There can be no doubt about that. The only question is this: if Europe suddenly starts a war itself, I think everything will end very quickly. This is not Ukraine. With Ukraine, we are acting in a surgical, careful manner. This is not a war in the direct modern sense of the word. If Europe suddenly decides to start a war with us and actually does so, A situation may arise very quickly in which we will simply have no one left to negotiate with.
At the same time, Moscow appears to be expanding the geography of the war. In a recent meeting, Putin called for creating a so-called security zone along Ukraine's border, essentially an attempt to push deeper into the Kharkiv, Sumy, and Chernihiv regions. Russian military bloggers and propaganda outlets also began circulating false claims about preparations for a major offensive of these regions. Ukraine's Center of Countering Disinformation immediately debunked this. Experts note that Russia lacks the manpower to open a new front, and such rumors are part of cognitive warfare designed to pressure Ukraine and its partners during these negotiations. Last year's failed Russian offensive in the Kharkiv region is a reminder. A new large-scale assault is unlikely. What's far more realistic is continued missile and drone terror. Putin's playbook is familiar. Talk about peace while threatening escalation, hoping Western governments will push Kyiv into concessions. In this context, the situation on the front lines is especially telling, particularly around Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region. Russia has officially claimed to have taken the city, but the Ukrainian side has denied this. According to Brigadier General Yevhen Lasychuk, commander of the 7th Air Assault Corps, the notional line of separation in Pokrovsk runs along the railway, and the northern part in the city is fully controlled by Ukrainian forces. Speaking about the connection to Mirnograd, the general said that the logistics are difficult, but not lost. He also added that the Ukrainian Armed Forces Command is strengthening this direction with the most prepared units. The situation on the front line this week was also commented on by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Force of Ukraine, General Alexander Syrsky. In an interview for Sky News, he said that, as of now, Russia shows no signs of stopping its military action and is using peace talks with the Ukraine as a cover.
Our strategy is to exhaust the Russian army as much as possible, prevent its advance, hold our territory, while simultaneously striking the enemy in the near rear, the operational depth, the deeper into Russia itself, with the aim of undermining its defense capability and industrial capacity. All of this is what the enemy has been using against us. By doing so, through selective offensive actions, we maintain the operational initiative.
Institute for the Study of War and several Western outlets describe Russia's advance as extremely slow and costly. The city is almost fully destroyed. Most civilians now are evacuated, and logistics is complicated. And yet Russia still hasn't secured full control over the road junction it needs to push toward Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. Ukrainian units launch local counterattacks and use drones and precision artillery to make holding ground difficult for Russian forces. Interestingly, that Pokrovsk is now being mentioned in Western media as a negotiation lever. Moscow portrays its capture and a reason to freeze the front line and legitimize its territorial gains. But the reality is different. Russia's military progress is minimal, and the country's economy is starting to falter. This week, Russia's so-called Shadow Fleet came under attack again. The tankers used to bypass sanctions and fund the Kremlin's war machine. In late November, Ukrainian Sea Baby naval drones struck two such tankers in the Black Sea, causing critical damage. Days later, another vessel, the Mid-Volga II, reported a drone attack near the Turkish city of Sinop. After that, a major Turkish shipping company suspended operations with Russia. If these attacks persist, the consequences for Russia could be severe. Soon, there may be no companies willing to take on the risk of working with Russia's oil sector. In addition, Ukraine continues to strike deep inside Russian territory. On the night of December 6, Ukraine's drone forces hit the Alchevsk metallurgical plant in the occupied part of the Lugansk region. This plant produces casings for Russian shells. The Ryazan oil refinery was also attacked again. This was reported by the commander of Ukraine's drone forces, Robert Madar Brody. He posted the video on Telegram. The footage is truly impressive. Trying to avoid losing his remaining customers, Putin traveled to India for the first time in 4 years. There, he and Prime Minister Narendra Modi reaffirmed their strategic partnership and signed several new agreements. Moscow offered New Delhi uninterrupted supplies of oil and other fuels despite Western sanctions. On the occasion of Putin's visit, India Today released a cartoon that shows the leaders of Russia and India riding a motorcycle past oil platforms and singing songs about their friendship. So they look very happy. The video also features United States President Donald Trump, who supposedly owns a gas station. And both cartoon friends, Putin and Modi, make fun of him. As a reminder, the United States recently imposed a 25% tariff on certain Indian imports in response to India buying Russian oil at discounted prices. So Washington publicly accuses New Delhi of helping Moscow finance its war against Ukraine. The Independent warns that Putin's actions could seriously harm his relationship with President Trump. We're discussing these key issues with an expert in our studio. So, Dr. Jason J. Smart, political advisor. Hello.
Hi, it's great to see you.
So let's start our talk with the United States-Russia talks in December 2nd. So Washington called the meeting as positive, but the Kremlin, through Yuri Ushakov, immediately said that it was fundamentally different. How do you think? Who is right? And what is Moscow expecting when they tell something, some statements like that? They not agree with the United States opinion.
So I think we have to understand a few different things here. Why are these statements made to begin with? The first reason is this, is that each side has an audience to whom they're speaking. And that's not the public necessarily in the United States. In the case of Ushakov, he has to say what will be useful for the Russian population, to express what's going to be in the Russian news the next day. He's got a specific target audience. But another aspect of this as well is to always make it look like Russia is not agreeing and it needs more compromises. That's Russia's objectiveness. Now, in the case of the United States, its statements that it put out after this meeting, statement that it put out after the meeting with the Russians was very similar. It said, we believe these were very good talks. This is a great step, and there's more work to be done. Now, in that case as well, I think they're trying to foster a warmer relationship. They've been saying this, by the way, for 10 months, so it's not the first time, but they always put forward this sort of an idea that we're getting closer and closer to a peace deal. Their objective is, again, for the U.S. audience, so it makes it look like there's progress being made and things are improving. So everyone here has got an objective of what they're trying to serve. But at the same time, the Russians very clearly are not interested in peace. This is all just a show. And I think that going forward, we're going to see these talks eventually break down because of that. Russia today is able to just string along the West with this notion that it was interested at being a normal part of the civilized world. Quite obviously, it is not. Just last night, we had one of the largest attacks in the history of this war by drones and missiles by the Russians who are attacking Ukraine. This shows you how much the Russians are interested in peace. The fact is, they are not interested in peace.
Do you agree with statement that Russian attacks, they compared to their lie about what they do on the front line? Because, you know, that story that they told in their TV show that Pokrovsk is even the Russian city and something like this.
Yeah, Russia's got a really big problem because the reality of this world is a lot different than the reality that their officials believe exist or that they like others to believe exist. The reality today is that Russia is not doing well. Now, here in Ukraine, they're failing in many, many different ways. They've lost over 1,100,000 soldiers in the course of just the past 3.5 years. They're eating up tens of billions of dollars, which at this point they can no longer afford. The Russian ruble is looking that it will devalue about 35-45% in the next month or so. Today, the Kremlin is not able to balance its budget. And in fact, its deficit is growing rapidly. There's a lot of problems. And that's not to even get into the fact that the elites in Moscow are beginning to fight with each other more and more. This battle that's currently existing between the FSB and the military is one that is spreading and is something that will jeopardize the future of the Putin regime itself. But let's just look at why they say what they do. Again, this is because they would like the world to believe that Russia is advancing, that Russia is having great successes. But inherently, it's obvious that Russia is not having successes when their 3-day special military operation is resulting not in Kiev being taken, but Pokrovsk. Now, for weeks and weeks, they've told us Pokrovsk is being taken or has been taken or is about to be taken. The fact is, this has been over 20 months of trying to take a town called Pokrovsk, a town that nobody in the West and Vladimir Putin did not know existed before this war began. The fact is, he's saying that because they cannot say we took Kiev. They have failed. In every indicator that we can look at, they have not taken Ukraine economically, military, or politically. And today they're bragging about we're almost about maybe to take Pokrovsk. I would say that's very far from being a victory for the Russians.
Yes, and why do you think this issue about situation on the front line is so important in negotiations right now?
I think there's a couple different objectives that the Russians have. Now, one part of this, of course, is back home in Russia, they have to sell the idea that this is going well. Because when the talks eventually break down, they have to say we were already making progress, and that's why it doesn't make sense to stop right now. But there's another aspect of this as well. They want to make the West believe that eventually these other territories that are not under occupation in Donbass are about to fall. So if it's imminent that they're going to fall, it's just a matter of time, then it'd be totally rational to say, well, listen, we're going to save lives, just give them what's an eventuality anyways. But the absurdity of that argument is very simple. At Russia's current casualty rate, which is about 170 to 180 soldiers per square kilometer taken, it would cost the Russians more than 1.25 million more casualties to take the rest of Donbass. That's wholly unrealistic. So today, the Russians would like to create the perception that they're doing very well, that time is on their side, but history doesn't support that argument. In fact, history supports the opposite argument. Every time that Russia gets into a major war with a smaller country, whether it was with Finland, whether it was with Japan, whether it was with, look at Chechnya, a territory within its own country, they had to carpet bomb the city of Grozny in order to subdue it. That has a population of 1 million and change. So how is there any hope they would take Kiev? Wholly unrealistic. But they like to give themselves this fantasy that they're so close to victory. The truth is quite different.
And you know, the problem is economic situation now in Russia. We know about some near default situation, and their war machine still needs lots, millions or trillions of Russian ruble. So with this situation, how do you think where they find these sources for continuing fighting with Ukraine?
So it's sort of funny. Russia today is running a Ponzi scheme. And what they do is this. They issue bonds to the federal government, which are then bought by the government from another branch of it, and it goes around in a circle after circle. But today, those bonds, really, what value do they have? What value does the ruble have? And that's where we get to a very interesting point. Recently, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Russia, as well as their central reserves, are starting to sell off their gold supply. And it's a very strange thing that a country has a huge gold supply and is now selling off. But what does that really mean? Well, it's very simple. The fact is, the elites understand that the ruble is worthless, and they've got a lot of them. There's a lot of people in the elites who make a lot of money from this war. But what are they going to do now? What are they going to do when their currency loses 35 or 45% of its value? Well, that's why they're selling off the gold. It's really not about the interest of Russia. It's the interest of the elites trying to buy up this gold, because gold, one, will have a value that appreciates, but secondly, it can be sold anywhere in the world, unlike rubles. So today, it looks like more and more there is this strategy from some of the elites of how to get out of Russia when things eventually collapse. And more, it seems that Russia's collapse is getting closer.
And you know, also in our broadcasts, even in Russian UATV, we talked to Ukrainian experts about the situation in Russian army. And the situation is that some soldiers, so Russia's government, they told about some million of pays of going to war to a front line, but they don't pay for that people. And the mood of Russian soldiers is very, very bad. Looking at this situation, how do you think, how long maybe that soldiers can still be on that front line with a situation like this?
Well, first we have to understand this is not the first time in Russian history this has happened. This happened before. And usually, if we want to look at World War I as a good example of this, if we want to look back at what we saw in the Afghan war, we see a commonality, which is Russia overextends itself, gets into something it can't really afford to do. Its leadership remains arrogant and doesn't accept the facts of the realities of the ground. And as a result, they lead to their own demise. So that's not uncommon in Russian history. That's a commonly repeating topic. But there's something else here that's interesting. The soldiers themselves, we realize, are increasingly unhappy. We see the statistics, we see the numbers. The number of deserters from the Russian military has continued to increase. The mortality rate in the Russian military has continued to increase. Suicide in the Russian military is very clearly also increasing if you follow Russian news. So if you look at all these different features, yeah, I think it's very fair to say, plus the fact that they kill their own officers at times, that there is a serious problem with morale in the Russian military. Now, when you don't pay them, that creates more problems. But imagine also this. Not that you don't just pay them, but can you imagine those who do get paid are going to lose 35 or 45% of their salary in the coming weeks. So Russia is already struggling to find more men that want to join. The only reason they can find anyone is because people are desperate, and it pays very highly compared to the rest of the Russian economy for people with no skills and no other opportunities. But now when you take away the financial incentive, when the ruble loses its value, it's no longer such a good deal. And this is where I think we get to a point that Russia starts to really run the risk of having an internal collapse within their army simply because the soldiers' own morale is destroyed, but also the economic factors that work into that condition as well.
And the situation's getting worse with Ukrainian strikes to Russians' oil infrastructure. Can you tell about the situation they have now because of these Ukrainian strikes?
So obviously the Ukrainian strikes have been very important. As you know, over 20% of capacity was taken offline. Some facilities like Ryazan have been struck almost a dozen times. That's outside of Moscow and feeds the capital area. But there's something else that's really sort of interesting here. So aside from these attacks being very effective, limiting Russia's ability to refine oil, it's also affected Russia's partners. Russia was selling a lot of its gasoline and refined products to its neighbors. Today, they also had shortages because of these attacks. This means that Russia is no longer a reliable partner for them either. So even though they'd like to have good relations with Russia, let's imagine, they realize that we have to find other options because Russia simply is no longer a reliable resource. That means it's going to further cut into the economy after those refineries are fixed. But if we go down further, what does this mean in the long term? Well, this also means something else. Today, for Russia, the ability to fix things like refineries is becoming increasingly complex because Ukraine isn't just striking in these massive facilities, just any random part of it they can find. Mm-hmm. They're going after the parts that are the most complex, the most sensitive. Why? Usually they're made in the West, and due to Western sanctions, it's going to be very hard for Russia to replace them. The objective here is to create a systemic cascading effect across the oil industry, and that's what they're effectually doing. But it gets even more interesting if you look at the export of oil. The ongoing attacks on the shadow fleet today are something that will be a game changer. We've already seen companies that were engaged in this illegal trade who have said they are no longer going to do it because there's just too much risk. The insurance cost is realistically just it's far higher than what it should be in the market. But that's because if you're going to insure something like one of these tankers, you're running a statistically reasonable chance that it'll be attacked. But more than this, let's imagine what happens. If that tanker does get attacked, what do you think the probability is that somebody's going to pay you out for this cargo that's worth, let's say, $70 million plus the ship? The fact is it's going to be lost. That company's going to declare bankruptcy and disappear. So if we look ahead at what's going to happen, I think it's going to become harder and harder for Russia to incorporate petroleum into its national strategy.
Yeah, really. And now there is a huge problem even with fuel in different parts of Russia. So people can't even drive cars because of this. And the interesting thing is that Russians, they're like no feeling a problem. They can't see any problem in it. And I don't know if there are some viewers watching our interview now that maybe people live in Russia or know people who live in Russia. If you can tell something to that people still living there in Russia, I mean, what can you tell to them? Any advices maybe?
The thing is that we have to segment Russia into a couple different populations. The vast majority of Russia truthfully lacks agency. They don't really matter to the Kremlin. They don't matter to anyone else. They don't get to vote. And they live, let's say, hours from Moscow. They don't have any financial capital. They don't have any means of actually leveraging anything against society. So they can't vote out their leadership. But also, they're generally speaking quite impoverished. I mean, they live at a level, the average Russian is poorer than the average person in India. So they really have no resources. How much can they really do? But where there is actual leverage, let's look at two parts of Russia, namely Moscow and St. Petersburg, which historically are the only two cities that matter in any decision making. But even there, we could say there's a specific part of Moscow. It's the northwest part of Moscow, which is where the powerful and the elites live. But if we look at that specific group, I think that increasingly they should understand, and they probably do understand, that their country is headed for total disaster. And what they perhaps don't realize is their leadership is not going to be there to save them when it finally collapses. Let's look what happened when Prigozhin, back 2 years ago, with the Wagner Group, the private military company, left Ukraine, headed towards Rostov on the way to Moscow. He was leading an uprising against Shoigu and Gerasimov, who's the head of the military and the minister of defense at that period. So as he was heading there, what do we see? Did we see that the Russian people came to the streets to fight him back, to defend the Putin regime? Quite the opposite. We saw the people of Rostov brought him food, they brought him water, they brought him wine, they treated him like a hero. What did the Russian authorities do? Well, the Russian border guards did nothing. The Russian police did nothing. The Russian National Police did nothing. The FSB did nothing. The Russian military did nothing. The Russian National Guard did nothing. The Chechens were only 100 kilometers away. In the course of 6 hours, they said, due to traffic, they couldn't get there. The truth of the matter is this. They didn't want to fight Prigozhin because they weren't sure if perhaps he would next take power. But let's go one more step further than this. What did the very senior leadership of Russia do? Well, we saw that Vladimir Putin himself got out of town. He immediately escaped. It looks like he went north and then eventually ended up in Valdai. Where did we see Dmitry Medvedev? Dmitry Medvedev went totally silent. He didn't write anything, didn't say anything. He disappeared. Kirill, the patriarch of the Orthodox Church, what did he do? Totally became silent and also ran away from Moscow. The senior leadership of the Putin regime fled, is what happened when Prigozhin uprising. What does that tell you about the stability of the regime? It is a total myth that the Russian regime today is a strong regime. It is quite the opposite. There is not one data point that would support that. The fact is, they talk a lot about being tough, but when push comes to shove, Russia routinely loses wars to smaller countries. Russia routinely takes huge losses to do that. And the reason really comes probably down to one central reason. They've historically had horrible leadership as they do today. Today, the Kremlin leadership is most interested in enriching itself, embezzling the resources of the state much more than they're interested in what happens next for either the Russian people or the Russian soldiers. So if you're a Russian soldier or a Russian person or somebody in the upper classes, I hope that it's abundantly clear these people in Moscow, these people in the Kremlin, do not have your well-being at heart. They have their own economic interest, and those economic interests are to take advantage of you. They are cheating you.
Yeah, true. And how do you think if these negotiations going right now, very long negotiations, if Russia failed with their some statements, some desires in these negotiations, how do you think will it change something in Russia, in people sitting in Kremlin or something like this?
I think the funny part about these negotiations is Russia never sought them. The fact is that they were sort of obligated to do it because the U.S. forced them. So they're doing what they have to do, which is say, sure, we're interested in talking about peace. We're always seeking peace. All the evidence is to the contrary. For that matter, just look at the lead up to the recent negotiations in Moscow. Putin, the day before, goes out in his military uniform, makes all these statements about how Russia's ready for war, how it's taken Vovchansk, it's taken Pokrovsk, all false statements. Now, this is a project faith before the American officials meet with him the next day. The next day, he shows up 3 hours late to meet the American representatives. Why is that? Well, he was giving a speech. Now, let's be honest. Vladimir Putin knows his schedule very well. They can plan when the Americans are going to be there. This is not a surprise. They didn't just drop by. But he intentionally showed up to project strength, to show them that he was not so concerned to meet with them. He would let them sit there and wait for 3 hours while he gave a speech about how Russia's economy was continuing to improve. Things are going great. But then he said something interesting. Putin typically, as you know, doesn't just go talk to the press. Unlike the U.S. president leaves the White House, goes to his helicopter, and the press asks him questions. That doesn't happen in Russia. So when he gets a question from the press, they happens to answer. That's staged, obviously. But in this case, he went on his little tirade about how he's ready to start a war or fight a war with Europe if necessary. Why would he do that within minutes of starting his meeting with the Americans? It's to project strength again, to give this idea that Russia economically is doing fine, Russia politically is doing fine, and Russia militarily is quite ready. But the facts on the ground are quite a bit different. And that's why today, looking at all this, these negotiations will fail. And the reason they will fail is Russia has no interest in peace. This is not in the direct economic interest of the leadership of Russia. Ultimately, if we want to understand the Russian leadership, we have to understand this. It is not about the interests of the Russian state or the Russian people. It is in the interest of the corrupt elites that they operate and continue to operate and will continue to operate.
The interesting thing, as for me, is that Witkoff and Kushner haven't commented their talks in Moscow. How can you explain why and what indicators can we see in this situation?
The fact is that they failed because, once again, they're trying to force something that Russia doesn't want, which is to continuous. They also don't understand correctly what's going on, I think. I think that inherently they believe this is about a territorial dispute or something like this, but it's not. Everything that the background to this, the entire history of this, is about Russia and Vladimir Putin doing what he thought was best for the oligarchical clans that run his country, what he felt was going to be in their direct interest because that's what keeps him in power. That's how they got into the situation. So as long as we don't speak to Putin on a level that he understands, which is that if you do not do this, it means that we will do something that will take you out of power. We will do something that will pose a significant risk to the stability of your regime. He doesn't care. So when we're talking about these things like these changes in the law, how should this be in these negotiations, it's all just a joke. For Putin, these things don't really matter. These are just modalities, but it gives an excuse to delay these negotiations. Russia historically and in the Soviet period did the same thing. What they would do is they would always just force delays in negotiations. We've had 10 months of the White House saying, we're getting closer to a deal. We're getting closer to a deal. Nothing has happened. Why? Russia has done this with every U.S. president for at least 70 years. This is the way they always operate. And this time it's no different. They don't want a deal. They just want to give the impression they want a deal so that they can have perhaps some of the sanctions taken off them, unfreeze some of their money. This is what Russia really wants.
Yeah, true. And another fact about negotiation, the interesting fact about time, that talk in Moscow lasted like 5 hours, but while in Florida, they went for 3 days. What could it mean in real life? Why so different?
I think the reality is that the Russian side didn't give anything that was clear, and it's just highlight the difference between these two that you just mentioned. Do you remember the phone call between Ushakov, the presidential advisor in Russia, with Dmitriev, who's the chief negotiator? In that phone call that was brief, they said, what of the demands should we send to the Americans? They said, let's send those 28 points, the hardline ones. Now, what's interesting about that is this was a very brief phone call. They agreed, and they sent this 28-point plan to the Americans. But you know what they didn't say? They didn't say, do you remember the talks that we had in Alaska? Do you remember the talks that we had the time before? Do you remember the meetings that we had in Geneva? Do you remember? No, they didn't mention any of that. Why? Because all these negotiations for 10 months have been a total waste of time. They didn't consider any of these details. They've wasted hundreds of thousands of man hours, people flying across the world to meet with each other, but they knew no matter what anyone said, their position would never change. And guess what? Their positions have not changed. They remain exactly the same. So we're wasting time talking about, will this point change or how will this point change? Listen, Russia will find an excuse, a justification to extend this and kick the can down the road a little bit further. This is what Russia has historically done because it understands a few different things. One, the West is historically impatient. It understands that there's news cycles, which it tries to compete with, and the political leaders worry about their reputation. So they want to show some results. But secondly to that, there's political cycles. There's elections. And so they try to figure out what they can do to put pressure on the West using those two different leverages so that the Western leaders feel that they're compelled to make a deal, even a bad deal, which serves Russian interest because they're worried about their own democratic political goals back in their home countries.
And the last, my favorite maybe question, how do you think what we will see in this year? Maybe this is December and we have less than 1 month, or the closer time, maybe some 2 or 3 months in these negotiations.
I think the reality is that they are going to continue to delay this as best they can. If they seek anything at all, for instance, if Russia gets any sort of a break in its sanctions, if Russia gets any sort of relief from not having its assets that are currently frozen given over to support Ukraine, that for Russia would have made all of these talks, these 10 months of wasted time, a huge victory. Because ultimately that's what Russia wants. Russia wants the ability to extract from the West what is not in the interest of Ukraine nor the West, but in the interest of Russia. To waste everybody's time, to waste all of our efforts, and to not get a peace deal, but in fact, to get more things that will allow them to continue committing war against Ukraine.
And can we see some huge sanctions maybe in that situation?
I think the key thing at this point is going to be the enforcement of sanctions. It's really up to the West to enforce sanctions. At this point, we have significant sanctions, but things like the Shadow Fleet are a great example. We know where it is all the time. It's not hard to find the ships. By international law, by maritime law, we have the not only right, but obligation to stop these ships that are engaged in the international trade of oil, but also do not meet international safety standards. They do not meet the standards necessary for environmental standards. They, one time after another, are a threat to the countries around which they transport themselves. And the best thing we could do is to stop the Shadow Fleet, not even to support Ukraine, but in our own interest. We should immediately be working now to stop the Shadow Fleet and arrest and prosecute those who operate it.
Thank you very much for this talk, for your thoughts about the situation and negotiations. I was happy to see you in our studio. Dr. Jason J. Smart, political advisor, was in our studio. I'm Yulia Horova. Thank you so very much for your time and attention and standing firmly with Ukraine. We'll see you next week. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel so to stay tuned to what is happening in the world, presented to you by us, UATV in Ukrainian perspective.